So I don't know, how many of you had the chance to read that? So you're probably like, holy cow, as she's describing what's going on in her soul. And she's describing it in a very visceral way, the pain, the torment, but most of it's all in direct relationship to God, directly related to her relationship with God. And what we're talking about here is actually more mystical theology versus ascetical theology. And it's this simple. Theology has to do with God's work, right? Or how grace works. Ascetical theology is what we do in God's plan of salvation. Mystical theology is what God does. So God's working, right? He does a particular work. But it's not merely passive on our part in the sense like we have something to do too. We call that ascetical theology. And the more that we grow in the spiritual life, the more we're living mystical theology. It's basically what God's doing in the soul. So in the beginning of our spiritual life, and the way that we train young people, as far as the traditional way of growing in the interior life, we begin by what? Talking about fasting, right? Giving up things, offering up your sufferings. Those are heavily focused on what we do. And that has to be a very, very important part of it. And if you look at the lives of the saints, St. Francis, St. Ignatius of Loyola, St. Teresa of Avila, you notice in the beginning of their spiritual lives, they took on, they had an encounter with God, an awakening experience. So they didn't start with these severe penances. The first movement was a conversion where they experienced an encounter with God, like a powerful encounter. These individuals did. That's not going to be all necessarily our experiences, but they had profound encounters. This led them to want to live more radically for God, right? Because they wanted to live this relationship, be fully alive in this relationship. And the way to do that is what? To strip themselves off of the world, right? And the ascetical practices, like St. Francis of Assisi, the radical way that he lived, basically selling everything, penances that he would do, denying himself, not eating for long periods of time. It was very hard on his body, and those effects on his body endured for the rest of his life. So also for St. Ignatius, the hard penances they did. So it wasn't like they went through this stage and then there wasn't no consequences. St. Francis said towards the end of his life that he treated Brother Ass too harshly. Okay, but that's typical, and sometimes you see this, right, with people who are, and it's mostly when people who are younger have been awakened, and there's this movement to live radically for the Lord. You see them like want to take on some like denying themselves sleep, but a lot of self-denial and taking on of penances. So if you notice that something like a younger person and you're seeing them in the church a lot, and that they're taking on a lot of spiritual exercises, you can bet that they have entered into the ascetical way, and ascetical means basically exercise, training, asceticism. And so mystical theology then is like, okay, now what's God actually doing in the soul? How is God working? And in mystical theology, God's plan, how he works in our particular soul, our proper soul, is going to be an experience that's much more passive. And so this is what you're going to get in the reading today, that all these things are happening to her, right? And she finds herself annihilated. That's the word. John on the cross, we call what she's experienced the annihilation of the soul. Right? Okay, so don't be anxious about what we're reading here. We'll put it into context. And we're trying to give it some logic as far as like God's logic. Literally, theology means God's logic. The logos. Theo, God, logic, logos, God's logic. And I think it's just super beneficial to have an appreciation for this and some knowledge, because it helps us to interpret kind of what's going on. And that's why she's writing here. I mean, you notice in some of the sections as if she's writing to someone else to give them some advice. And the writings of the saints to help us, to give us somewhat of a roadmap, because even good people who are like even serious about their faith and trying to live for the Lord in our day and age, if you just lifted some of her descriptions of what she's what's going on within her, and then you're just like, okay, I'm going to just do a little experiment, and I'm going to share this with a person. How about we'll just lift it right here. Okay, have a little fun. Okay. Okay, so look at 109. 109. So let's say that you have a good Catholic friend that you're talking to. Like, how's your prayer life going? And they say to you, it's like Elizabeth says to me, pretty good. I mean, pretty good. I'm more consistent in going to Mass on Sundays. Whoa, okay. Okay, this is hypothetical. Okay. But then, okay, and then Elizabeth says to me, well, how are you doing, Father? Well, I'll have to tell you, like, I feel like, God has completely abandoned me. I mean, my experience in prayer is that God's hating on me. Oh, what advice would you give me? Something's wrong, right? What are you doing that's wrong? That's not God's voice. Yeah. So it's like, you can see how if you're experiencing some of these things and you would share them with another person, it would be easy for them. Well, you need to lighten up. Quit taking yourself so serious, Father. Okay. When's the last time you've been to Andy's? Okay, do you see? Okay, let's just say, and this is what she's saying, God's the one who's doing the work here, and we'll explain what his logic is, his reasoning, how this works. But what would happen if I'm getting counsel from a fool, someone who doesn't have wisdom? And this happens a lot. Like, I need to relax my way, maybe go in a different direction. And I could be sent in a complete different direction. And did you guys notice in here how she was saying about a spiritual director?
Yeah.
She couldn't find one. Yeah, she couldn't find a director. What section was that?
108.
Okay. During those times, I had no spiritual director. I was without any guidance or any kind of guidance whatsoever. I begged the Lord for a director, but he did not give me one. So, why? Exactly, why? What would be the logic there? Because probably what a director would do with the way that God was working in her soul at that time, to find a director that would be worth his mettle, right? To give good advice, probably didn't exist. Okay, at that moment, but did that end up being her mode of operating for the rest of her life? No, because it said that what? She got one. So it can very well be, it's like we're going through a particularly difficult time when it would seem like I need a doctor. I need some help right now. And it might be, this doesn't mean you shouldn't, she begged and sought, okay? So don't be passive about this, especially in a difficult time, to like get some counsel from a person in this regard. But if I'm not able to find anybody, or find anybody who understands or listens to me, or I can appreciate, I can get discouraged about that and feel myself just isolated and alone, right? Or she's giving me a little counsel here that what? No, God's wanting to be my director right now. And I just have to keep trusting in him, and I'm going to pass through this way. Because ultimately, in the midst of when she's going through, St. John of the Cross's word again is annihilation, but she uses torment and misery and everything else. When she's going through this time of annihilation, she learns to what? Just radically throw herself onto the mercy of God. So not trust in somebody else's counsel or direction or advice, but Jesus, I trust in you. Where does that come from? Jesus, I trust in you. Right?
Mercy.
Divine mercy. So isn't it interesting the way that you come to understand and appreciate divine mercy? For her, what she's showing us is basically it's through the way of misery that she comes to find mercy. What does she also say? Just like, or any thoughts about that? Yes.
Well, so say, like what if you don't like ride that out? Like what if like you look at your kids and like what if they didn't like come to the point that she did where she realizes that the darkness is actually really like it is like that God is actually closer to you in those points.
Mm-hmm.
And then they go like in this opposite direction. It's like, I mean,
Yeah.
then they got a really long way to come back to.
Yeah, and if you, Jackie, just that's at least somewhat connected with what you're saying in 109. Okay, the soul's vision is plunged into darkness, and though God is nearer than ever to the soul which is suffering, this whole secret consists in the fact that it knows nothing of this, that God is close. It doesn't feel any of it. The soul, in fact, declares that not only has God abandoned it, but it is the object of his hatred.
Right.
So it's like you can talk to them till they're blue in the moon as far as like, no, God's not going to tempt you, give you more than you can handle. That's like the last thing you want to kind of hear. But it's true. The reality is, so I think, is like, it is true, but the person kind of has to discover it for themselves. I mean, that's what she discovers. That doesn't mean I don't think that you don't give them support and counsel, some support and counsel in that direction, based upon where they're at. Now, keep in mind, this is her circumstance of that. It may not. I think the regular practice is that God does give you someone to accompany you.
Yeah.
Okay? So I would call this a little bit extraordinary and with a particular intensity. So a lot of the time, like those men and women who go into cloisters or religious houses are going to experience probably a greater intensity in a shorter amount of time, right? They don't have the distractions of the secular world. Okay, so I think there's a fierceness and intensity that's probably not going to be experienced. For the rest of us, it's going to be gradual over time. Getting back to your question, it's like, what do you do, or how do you help them when they're going through that? I think one of the things that has to be done is, and this is part of the person's who loves them's response, is that they have to surrender that person to God. Think about the Blessed Virgin Mary. What did she? I mean, what did she probably wanted to do everything to help, to be assist and stand in the way, and what was probably her interior trials? What was the greatest thing for her of just to let her son go?
Silence.
What's
She
that?
was silent.
Yeah.
She didn't step forward like one of us would.
So why do you think she didn't do that?
Well, she knew the plan, I guess, and trusted in God's plan.
Okay, I think she knew the plan. I don't know if she knew the plan, but she did trust in God's plan, that God's got this, right? Because we know from already early on that, well, like, I don't understand this, how can this be? But let it be done. Yeah. Yeah.
So God is going to test you, yes, to strengthen your faith, presumably, but at the same time, He doesn't want to lose your soul, which is sometimes, when Jackie's referencing your children, you see that.
Yeah.
You think, well, how do you get them back on, God? They're going the wrong way, you're testing them, but why does He test them so far that they're lost?
Yeah. Well, I think look at the prodigal son.
So you just wait with patience?
Well, the father did not go run after him.
No, he didn't.
And why is that? He could have.
Uh-huh.
He waited for him.
That's what I'm thinking, yeah.
But that son had to discover his destitution. And then he finally came back. Like it was in the experience of losing everything
Right.
that he discovered everything. Now, okay, don't make that, like, this is all kind of, this is part of the path and the way, but each situation and person is particular, so everything has to be discerned while knowing the general rules of how things work, right? Because with the prodigal son, it's maybe not gonna, it's like, it falls under the same category, but maybe it's looking a lot different. For you particularly. So I think, Jackie, like part of it is we have to manage ourselves well first. And that's a painful stripping to let that go because they may die, right? But then does that mean that I just remain passive, purely passive? No, she wasn't passive in this regard. She still sought out a director. She sought out help. So those would be some general guidelines I would say that would be helpful. And I think, like when we love a person, we know them pretty well, so we know their particular weaknesses. Is this at what level, where is this person struggling or suffering, right? And so that lead it, and how do they respond? So I have to use all of those to make a good judgment. And I still want to use my reason and apply my reason to the situation, but with a holy indifference. So a holy indifference doesn't mean I don't care. Holy means it's connected to God, and I'm entrusting it to God's plan, and so however this might turn out, right? I'm indifferent as long as God's got this. God's got this, and so as long as God's got this, I believe He's purely good. He's going to take care of it, and so I can be indifferent to the way I think it should turn out. Now that doesn't make it easy. And I think in here you have to notice is like it's not just a purely miserable plight. It's like she goes through, and it's like not over a long period of time, like the particular intensity. Then joy and surges, and she sees again. What section or paragraph is that? Oh yeah.
The top of 60 is struck by divine light. That sounds good.
Yep, she's struck by divine light, claims that there is no light, whereas it is so intense that, oh wait, that's a suffering here.
110, it says, O Lord, be not afraid to place the soul on the edge of a terrible precipice where it stands alarmed and filled with fright, and then you call it back again to yourself.
Yeah, yep. And some of her experiences of being called back to God in this section that we're covering today.
She even talks about it in 107, Father,
Okay?
where she says, "Oh my God, I've come to know that I am not of this earth. You, O Lord, have poured this profound awareness into my soul. My communion is more with heaven than with earth, though I in no way neglect my
So
duties."
those are the effects of what's going on, what happened to her, right? She comes out of it with what?
A new awareness.
A new awareness, an experiential awareness, not a book knowledge. So she knows through experience that my communion is more with heaven than with earth, though I in no way neglect my duties. So, what was St. Paul? Those who don't work, or St. James, should not eat. It's like, okay, now because they were early on in the church after Jesus died. They were thinking that he was going to come back quickly, and then there were some people who quit their jobs and went work and were just in a waiting pattern, right? And then he didn't come back. So it's just interesting that she says, okay, this is happening in my soul now. Like, I'm not as attached to the things that I thought were going to make me happy, because basically that stripping experience has freed me from that. And so now that, like, I'm not going to go back to that, because I know that leads nowhere. And if I go back to those earlier loves, I can think about the goals that we had when we were younger. It's like, what's going to make us happy? And then we've been through the trials and struggles of life, and like, it didn't make me happy. And then you notice that there's not an inclination to go back there again. And so that's leaving us open to moving us towards higher goods. But we don't do it to the extent of like neglecting our duties, if that makes sense. I think this can happen even, I think this is a natural process even just with human loves. This is the season, graduation season, and some parents their kids are gonna be going off to college. And so that's a big transition for parents. And with the first kid that leaves, it often is particularly painful, right? For the mother, but not the father. Just kidding. And because so much of what the parents knew, their life was so much centered around those children, right? And now, where I had rested my life and all of my investment, they're moving on, and they're kind of happy about moving on, and I'm not happy about moving on. But what happens once I go through that? I see that after that pain and suffering of loss and separation, the light will often come back if I'm on the right path of like, well, I think I might have invested myself too much of my identity and life in this person, right? And so I can let them go. And so there's a good indifference there, but that doesn't mean because I'm more indifferent now, like I'm not overly attached. It doesn't mean that I still don't do my duties, as she would say. And so I think this happens, in all loves. Your first job, you've been preparing and being educated in such a way, and it's like you're going to find so much of your identity into it, right? And then you move on, and you go through that painful process, and you just find yourself less attached the next time, right? Because you've got perspective now in that regard. So I think just the logic here, the God logic here, is that she's gone through all of this, and now her communion is more with heaven, more with the things of God, and not the way that she thinks that things are going to roll out for her. Okay, let's go to um, 100. This is where we started. Section 100. So she's experiencing physical debilitation, so much so that she's not able to carry out her duties. So we don't know what the cause of that is. That does not need to be a spiritual cause. It could be a spiritual cause, but I wouldn't look at it as a spiritual cause. Because when St. John of the Cross talks about the dark night of the soul, that's what she's going through, okay? The dark night of the soul, the purification that God is bringing about. He says that it often begins through some natural, not catastrophic, but natural negative event. A sickness, right? A failure. Okay, that's so something in the sensible world that goes south for us. All right, so I think we can, and then that becomes a bridge into a purification that God wants to bring about on the spiritual level. And so that I think you could say that for her. And so how profound was this physical suffering? She couldn't even hide it on her face, right? What did the sister say? They're moved to pity because I look so terrible. Yikes. I thought no one could tell. Okay, so this is what she's experiencing. We don't know what the physical cause is, right? And so now she talks about moving from the body, talking about her soul. So soul pertaining to what she's thinking, what she's feeling, and also how it pertains to her relationship with the Lord. So the soul is engulfed in darkness. So darkness can refer to just under the understanding, but also darkness. St. John of the Cross talks about darkness at the feeling level too. That basically, I don't have any feeling. Like I've been thrown out or deprived of consolation in the affections, in the feelings. Engulfed in darkness, moans in the midst of these torments, and despite all this, thirsts for God as burning lips for water. Okay, so St. John of the Cross has criteria. How do you know if you're going through like a spiritual dark night or it's just like purely psychological or physical? Well, one of the signs is that the person is distressed because they think they may be doing something wrong in their relationship with God. They are very concerned about this. If it's just a mere psychological or physical ailment, there's no preoccupation with like that this has to do with God or that I'm doing something wrong with God but know that if it's truly a dark night, the person is distressed, he says, is concerned because they may be on the wrong track in their relationship with God. So that's one of the three signs that he says as far as like, how do you know this is spiritual and not just purely on the natural level? Questions on that? Yes. So she's having physical torment, okay, bodily, so much so she can't fulfill her duties. It's also in her soul at the psychological level. It's showing on her face, right? And how do you know that these physical and psychological sufferings are connected? That it's God's using this to bring a person to closer relationship with Him, versus just merely depression pure depression that has no connection with the spiritual life. Because in the midst of this, the person is God is really on their mind, and they don't want to do anything that would be deter them in their relationship with God, or harm that relationship. So I know that it could likely be God likely be using this if there is concern about my relationship with God through what I'm going, because a lot of people can suffer. A drug addict can suffer. I can be suffering because of a particular sins that I committed, and I don't care, like that God or sin doesn't even come to my mind, right? This is just purely a physical ailment. No, so this has been brought in, her ailment, her struggle has been brought into the spiritual realm. It's become part of the paschal mystery, a passion and death leading to resurrection. So, yeah.
So if you can't pray because of those feelings,
Yeah.
but you're sad because you can't pray.
Yeah. You're
You really-
distressed.
You want to pray, but you really feel bad.
You're really bothered because when you're sick, it's really hard to pray, right? And then you find yourself not being able to sustain yourself in prayer, and you're distressed about that. That's a great sign that God's using this to bring about spiritual purification. Yeah, but there's a lot of people that don't care. I mean, like they don't.
Yeah.
So it's just a purely natural suffering then.
So like then, well, how do you balance that like with the scrupulosity though? Because
How do you do what?
like, how is that different than like scrupulosity? Like, how does, or is that kind of the same or not?
Yeah.
Because that's a little different, right?
Yeah. Scrupulosity is another animal.
Right.
But it can have some similarities. And scrupulosity has a particular force in it that itself. It has a life of its own, and it's a torment that a lot of saints have gone through. Saint Ignatius of Loyola actually has rules for when you're going through scruples. Scruples are basically seeing sin where there's not sin, but it's happening to you in an incredibly intense way and a very passive way. It's not like you're just rationally you're trying to apply your reasons. No, it's like you're being attacked. Saint Therese of Lisieux went through this, the little flower. She said, it's worse than death. It's worse than death. Scruples are worse than death, and you can only know what they're like if you've been through them. That's how bad they are. How bad they can be. Does that make sense? Okay, so how would you know? You would know by how the person describes what their distress. So I can, even in the confessional, when people are talking to me, and they're talking maybe about a sensitivity over a particular sin. Okay, they're concerned about it, and it may be too much. And then the person who comes in that's scrupulous, I can recognize it in their voice. You know what I'm saying? Like I just doing it enough. So it's like, if it's scruples, if you're trying to help someone, you can see it versus a normal distress. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. It's like, I'm not giving you metrics to use, but it's kind of like, there is something to note, then you see it. Like this is, and it's like, oh, and it's like almost you can't hardly help the person.
Okay.
Well, because when I have scruples, it's like I'm
You have
going
scruples?
to hell sometimes.
No, right, exactly.
It
Yeah,
feels
okay.
like I'm going to hell. What can I do, you
Yeah.
know? Because I don't want to do this thing, but I do it, but,
Yeah.
why'd I eat all those potato chips?
Yeah. But it's not merely just the eating the potato chips is like this feeling of going to hell.
Yeah.
And it's usually for some, stupid, like venial kind of sins. It's like, it's just disproportionate. But you can't, And it's okay. It's an incredible stripping that happens in this, and it can be in various degrees. And part of the stripping is like normally you can apply your reason to the situation, and then reason your way out of it because this is like irrational. No, actually trying to use your reason when the scruples are severe makes it worse. You can't even trust your friend, your reason. I mean, that's when it's severe, like a St. Therese of Lisieux and Ignatius, what they experience. So they have to even be stripped of their reason. They have to abandon it and just trust. Jesus, I trust in you.
Yeah.
That's it.
That's it.
And what happens in there, though, in that experience, is the mind is actually trained. And St. Teresa of Avila, in talking about this, when she was experiencing the scruples, that's the time that she discovered that there's a distinction between the intellect and the mind. That the mind is something different. Up until then, you just think they're one. Whatever you're thinking and whatever you're feeling, you're guilty. But then you realize that this is not me. Is that making sense? Any other thoughts about that?
Yeah, why does God make it so difficult? I mean, really, I mean, we're trying to be really intellectual here and
Yeah.
follow him, and it's, how does the ordinary man in the street kind of come to the way of thinking about God when it's so challenging?
Yeah. Well, I mean, what I've read before is that like God has several paths in the sense that most people God doesn't want any soul to be lost. So like he doesn't make salvation impossible. In the sense of like there's an ordinary way, and most people take the ordinary way. But he offers a way of discipleship that's radical, but it's not under the requirement of sin. I mean, like if you do that, if you don't do this, you're sinning and separating yourself from me. So when Jesus said, "If you want to be my disciple, you must deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me," St. John Chrysostom said in that regard, in a commentary in the 5th century, that that Jesus did not make that saying compulsory. Whether you like it or not, you must bear these things. It was an invitation, so you could turn it down without sin.
Yeah, because
You see what I'm saying?
He said, if you will be perfect,
Yeah. Yes.
if you will be perfect,
Yeah.
then sell everything.
He
you
doesn't
have,
make
give
it
to the
compulsory
poor.
in the sense
Yeah.
of like you have to do this or you'll go to hell.
Yeah.
It's an invitation to come higher.
But that's what the devil, oh, sorry.
Didn't St. Teresa of Lisieux kind of take a simple way of this? She said, like, I'm not like the spiritual giants. I don't have all this, and I don't know like the very complex, all the understanding, all this. I simply love.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, that was her short way there. a very
Yeah.
simple way.
It was a radical way of trust and love. Right? But she suffered a lot in the midst of that, right? But it was radical trust. It was simple, and so it wasn't like through an elaborate plan of the spiritual life, which is when you have more than one step, it makes it complex. So her spirituality is not complex, it's simple. It's just direct surrender to God. Wherever, in the present moment, wherever she finds herself. Yeah. Jackie?
No, I think, the devil wants us to think though that it's all hard to stop,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But like, didn't St. Augustine say, like, it's better to love God than to know God? Something like that?
Yeah.
But like, he was super genius guy.
Right.
So, well, I guess just like keeping that in mind.
Yeah.
Um,
And so there's different spiritualities. So we have different religious orders, but it's all going in the same direction. But like if you think about the Dominicans, they pursue God heavily through the intellect and coming to know truth. However, even though St. Thomas Aquinas was the greatest of the Dominicans, once he had a vision of God towards the end of his life. He had written over 2 million words. He wrote so fast that he was dictating to 3 secretaries at the same time. He saw that everything he had written was straw. So, we can go to God. We should be seeking understanding and learning, but at the same time, at the end of the day, there is something, a radical truth or a primary truth of God, the simplicity of God and the simplicity of our relationship with God. This You, you don't have to study every book in the world and master all knowledge to come to God.
And most of us are little souls.
Right.
I like that.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's a lot faster way. Now, she would say Faustina would say probably though, in the midst of that, Emily, she would say, I still did my duty. So I'm not going to study. I'm not going to apply myself. Well, no, she wouldn't have said that. So you still, yeah, you live radically simply, but you apply yourself according to your state of life and what your circumstances are. And sometimes in life you have much more opportunity to enter in, and sometimes you don't, right? Okay, we got a couple minutes here. The amount of mercy and consolation she experiences after going through all of this. So, okay, you notice in 101, section 101, she feels like that she's rejected for all eternity. Okay, this is the culminating moment, this feeling of being rejected. Who else do you know that had that same experience, that was one of the most famous saints of the 20th century?
Mother Teresa.
Yep. She saw herself as rejected by God. God's rejected daughter. Okay, and God alone could test the soul in this way. So then, when she's moving out of this, okay, or the culminating moment, 57 now, I felt my body separate itself from the soul. So it's almost like she's describing like death, right? And though I wanted to go to my superiors, I no longer even had the physical strength. I uttered my last words. She's like she's going through the death process. I trust in your mercy. And then what? It all went to peace. Okay? All right. It seemed to me that I provoked God to even greater anger. So you're doing all the right things that used to work in the past, and now they're not working at all. But then the next section, she is assisted by someone else. Okay, she's not left alone now, right? So she has Simon of Cyrene to help her. And her religious superior says, don't be distressed about anything. I command this of you in virtue of obedience. If you want to talk about simple souls and simplicity, it's the way of obedience. Why is that?
Because you're not making the decision.
Yeah, I'm trusting, right? Versus like, I got to understand all this. You're going to be going really slow. And then she says, when I went into the chapel, I felt that my soul had been free from everything. 103, suddenly I saw the Lord interiorly, and he said to me, fear not, my daughter, I am with you. In that single moment, all the darkness and torments vanished. And then 106, and this is kind of the way we started off. Though these are frightening things, the soul should not be too fearful. That's good for us to kind of keep in mind because we've talked about some pretty heavy things today. Because God will never test us beyond what we are able to bear. So she was able to bear this. She did. Because how do we know? Because she did it. On the other hand, he may never send us such sufferings. But I write this because if it pleases the Lord to let a soul pass through such sufferings, it should not be afraid. I think that the whole purpose of these spiritual Saturdays is to normalize these things for us. It's like, because what people often, once they maybe share what's going on interiorly and they hear another person's experience it, a lot of times people's response is, I thought I was alone. I thought I was the only one. Nope. Right? And so she's saying it's like, no, you're not the only one. And this may not happen to you like this, but if it does, don't be afraid, insofar as it depends upon itself. God will do a subtle no harm because he is love itself. And then, however, when I was so tormented, I myself did not understand this. So it doesn't take away all of it. Yeah. Okay. All right, we'll end with the glory be. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
And may Almighty God bless you, the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.